we started to look at times when the free working market doesn't necessarily bring us to a good place. And so we looked at price ceilings and price floors. But what I'd like to do now is turn and look at another approach to looking at economics. One that tends to focus more on the dark side of a market economy than on the light side of it or the good side of it. Let's take a quick look at a biography of Karl Marx. We've all heard of Marx, and some of the things you heard about him were true, some of the things may not be. My favorite quote from Marx, written to his friend Friedrich Engels, towards the end of Marx's life, Marx wrote in a letter to Engels, "I am not a Marxist." And that always seems to me as a very interesting quote. Marx lived long enough to see some of his ideas be brought forward and tried to be implemented. And he may not have been really happy with what he saw happening. All right, quickly, Marx is born on May 5th in 1818 in Trier, Prussia, part of Germany. He first started to go to law school in Bonn, decides to switch, go to the University of Berlin, where he will meet his future wife. He switches universities again, receives his PhD, goes to work for a newspaper, Zeitung newspaper in Cologne, moves to Paris, meets Friedrich Engels, also a German, but who is working in some textile mills that Engels' father owns. Marx gives up his citizenship, which becomes an issue. He becomes a man without a state. It's clear in 1845 that the Prussian Secret Service are looking for him. He flees to Brussels, stays there a few years, finally moves to London. Marx will live the remainder of his life in London. Of his writings, his most well-known writing is Das Kapital, on capital. He only completes 3 of the 5 volumes that he planned to write. He passes away before he completes any of them, the last 2, volumes. So let's look at the assumptions that Marx makes. If you remember, when we looked at traditional economists, we looked at the assumptions they made about human nature, the good life, and good society. I'd like to go back and look at these, but now from the Marxist perspective. When you look at human nature, Marx must also assume rationality, for the same reason the traditional economists had to. People are rational, and that means they do what's in their best interest. They're going to act that way. They're going to be predictable. Marx needs us to be predictable also, and that we're going to act in our best interest. But Marx makes a slightly different assumption about how we act. He assumes we are a product of our environment. We are who we are because of when and where we were born, the experiences that we encounter in our lives. So society forms us into who we are. Now, this is going to be an issue for us later on, because if society forms us, how do we change society? Do we change society first? Do we change how we think first? It's a chicken and an egg kind of a debate. Which do we do first? Which comes first? All right. The thing is with the good life, how does Marx define the good life? He defines a good life in which basic needs are met. Now remember what we mean by basic needs: basic food, clothing, and shelter. Marx would add to that social interaction. He believed we as social creatures need to have interaction with others, whether it's at sporting events or at concerts or community centers, anything. We need to have places where we can come together and be part of the social fabric. The good society then also has to deal with that aspect of basic needs being met. So in the good society, everyone has access to basic needs. Doesn't mean you have to take the things that are presented, but you have access to them. If you choose not to take them, fine. If there's a football game and you choose not to go, well, that's your choice. You had access to it, but it's your choice not to partake. The second aspect of good society, as far as Marx is concerned, is that you have a say in what happens in your world. You have the right to say what happens in your neighborhood, what happens where you work. Voting becomes extremely important for Marx. It was a way of having your voice heard. All right, so let's kind of delve into some of Marx's work. In order to understand Marx, we need to understand something called the Hegelian dialectic. Marx very much is a product of the social structure or the educational structure of which he lived. Let's look at the Hegel, German philosopher Hegel, was a dominant force in German education at the time. And the Hegelian dialectic looked at how society changes over time and how decisions are made. Now let's look at the dialectic. We start with a thesis or an idea, a way of doing something. And let's say the world is flat. That's our thesis. As soon as we come up with a thesis, there is immediately an opposite, an antithesis or antithesis that comes up. If our thesis is the world is flat, our antithesis is the world is round. Now, Hegel argues these two different approaches to looking at the world cannot coexist simultaneously. Or cannot peacefully coexist, because when the antithesis is formed, there is a conflict between the two ideas, and out of the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis comes a synthesis. It is the remnants of this fight between the thesis and the antithesis. Now, interestingly, as soon as you have a synthesis, that becomes our new thesis. The synthesis becomes our thesis. As soon as there's a thesis, there's an antithesis. There's a fight between the two of them. And out of the fight of the second synthesis and the antithesis comes a new synthesis. And that keeps going. That is how society changes. Now, let's apply that to what Marx looked at as the evolution of Western society. Now, I want to apologize. that this is very much a Western-centric approach. So if it doesn't fit the societies that you come to, let's hold on to that idea. All right, so if we look at the evolution of society, we start with what Marx called primitive communism. This is where we started the cave people days, where we had hunter-gathering societies, where tribes followed the animals as they moved across the land. No idea of private property, everything was held communally. All of a sudden, we had agriculture, where we could own land, where we owned what came out of nature. Two very opposite approaches to looking at society. They could not coexist. And so out of the ashes of primitive communism comes slavery. Now, slavery is a bad word, here a bad name, because you and I think of slavery in a way that Marx wasn't looking at slavery. He called this slavery because it is at this point where humans enslave nature. We become so good at agriculture, we can have cities. And as city-states begin to form, we end up, think of the Greeks and the Romans, where they had the idea of a citizen who had all these rights and privileges, and compare them with the non-citizens. Think of the Roman Empire. At the height of the Roman Empire, less than a third of the population were Roman citizens. The vast majority were not citizens. They had no privileges. They had no rights. And so there's a conflict in society between these two groups. Out of the ashes of the conflict between citizens and non-citizens arises what we in the West call feudalism. Under feudalism, the conflict is between nobility and the peasants, the ruling classes and the working group. That society doesn't last. The Black Plague runs through, all of the social structures known in Europe fall apart. And out of the ashes of feudalism comes capitalism. Capitalism comes out of feudalism because it's with the collapse of feudalism that we get what we call a free labor force. Free because they're free of the constraints that feudalism put on them. The peasants can now go and look for work wherever they can find it. Whereas under feudalism, they were tied to the land. They couldn't move around because they were not going to be protected if they went anyplace else. So out of the ashes of feudalism comes this capitalism, where we see the division of labor and we see factories growing and all of that. And this is where Marx enters the picture. This is what Marx is living with. And he understands, or he believes, that capitalism is doomed, that there is a conflict between the capitalist class and the working class, that the capitalists have been using and abusing the workers, and their conflict is inevitably going to lead to the destruction of capitalism. And so Marx wants to look at capitalism and say, let's look at why this is bad, and let's look at how we can fix this. Because this dialectic approach is harmful to society. This building up only to cause something to crash is harmful to society. So in our next lecture, we need to look at the problems with capitalism so that we can create a new society that will have no internal conflicts, which will not fall apart.